Hello, and welcome to the Well Unread podcast. This is your host, Cameron, and this week we are reading the obviously classic Animal Farm by George Orwell. I chose this book because in the trailer slash intro episode that I filmed last week, I stated essentially that I started with reading and liking reading in middle and high school, right? So the first thing I thought about is why not read one of the first books that I remember reading, particularly I believe it was in the 7th or 8th grade, and that was Animal Farm. And of course, being many years older at this point, reading back, there's a lot that I might not have noticed, but I actually did have the original copy that I read back then. So it's kind of funny looking through my little notes and stuff in the book. The dog, the ear tags and things that I highlight or underlined or put it within brackets. So reading through that now, it was definitely very interesting, to say the least. But if you haven't read Animal Farm, which would be quite surprising, the premise of the book is that there are these animals that live on this farm, and the farm is ran by a man named Jones. And this man is, typical of any boss and or ruler, if we're looking at this as a completely separate location, right? As if this farm was its own country or state. And so Jones, being a kind of just a leader of this farm, he kind of just puts a lot of work into the animals, and then with little pay, right? So essentially, without getting too much into it, the animals that live on the farm, we were kind of fed up, right? And they participated in this uprising. And they essentially just chased Jones and the other workers, human workers, off the farm. And they took it over for themselves, right? So that obviously all happens within the first one or two chapters. And the whole idea of the book is just really seeing how we are really kind of destined to repeat ourselves in a lot of ways. And that's kind of why this episode was titled Revolt and Repetition, right? And that is because that is the core idea of this book, right? It's the idea that these animals, or someone that wasn't happy with the way they were being treated, revolt essentially the oppressor in this case, and they essentially take matters into their own hands. And we see, as the book goes on, essentially the inevitable repetition of what is to be essentially all this stuff happens again. Just to kind of quick recap. And again, I just wanted to dive into this book because I read it before. It's been many years, and it was very interesting. And also, given this is the first podcast episode, excuse the ums and the ifs and stuff like that, because given ample time to read this book, I resorted back to old habits, which is procrastinating to the last minute. So I definitely read all of this book within the last 3 days, technically, but a good portion of it just literally right before filming this podcast. So again, trying to get better with that with time, but that is kind of what we're looking at right now. Just because I didn't want to be late on this first episode, and that is going to be airing, if you're listening to this right now, it would be on Wednesday, the 30th of July. And again, the episodes going forward are kind of just going to be a little bit sporadic. This one I wanted to dive into. It might be a little bit political in some ways, and of course, take everything I say with a grain of salt. I did read the book, and I do have my own perspectives on what the book says, and then also my own political beliefs and things along those lines. But we'll see if there's anything that you don't necessarily agree with, or of course, if I'm just misspeaking, just obviously let me know. When it comes to factual things, historically and politically. I'm not super well versed in it, but I know enough that I feel like there's some definitely good talking points that I want to get into within this episode. To start off, obviously I gave a brief recap on the book itself, kind of what the general idea is and how we got started. All right, so quick summary. We have just a handful of different characters, which definitely are kind of parallels or mirror some historical figures, right? So we have after the Jones and his farm workers get run off the land, they initially kind of meet together and they essentially discuss what is the future of the farm. How are they going to run it without real knowledge of, what it takes to run a farm from like a, like financial stance, right? Because obviously they're the animals have been the ones doing the work and producing, whether that be through meat for some of the animals or like eggs and other things like that. But we have the main characters here, which are going to be mainly pigs in the beginning, and we have Napoleon and Snowball. And Napoleon is technically a mirror to Stalin in this time, because again, this book was written a bit ago. I believe it was published in 1945. And then we have Snowball, which is the other pig. This one supposedly is going to kind of mirror Trotsky. Hope I'm pronouncing that right. But these two pigs are essentially who kind of guide this initial stages of the like uprising that was to be known as Animal Farm. And they led these meetings, and they basically got everyone together and saying, this is going to be how it's going to be run. We're going to be doing these things. And then they kind of established a set of rules. And the rules, they painted up on the wall, on the barn wall, I believe. And they read initially, and we'll get into how they changed later. So they called them the 7 Commandments. And what these commandments were basically just a kind of a loose rule book of what it meant to be an animal living on Animal Farm. And these 7 commandments were: whatever goes upon 2 legs is an enemy. Whatever goes upon 4 legs or has wings is a friend. No animal shall wear clothes. No animal shall sleep in a bed. No animal shall drink alcohol. No animal shall kill any other animal. And all animals are equal, being the final commandment there. We come to learn that, through stuff, everything's somewhat going well on the farm. And then that's when we have the Battle of Cowshed. The Battle of Cowshed is when the local farmers, along with Jones, kind of come back with their guns and stuff, and they try to essentially take back the farm. Having had read one of the like war strategy type books, they were able to essentially fight back, and they won at the Battle of Cowshed. And it was at this battle that kind of everything changed for the farm itself, because this is kind of where we see a lot of the parallels. So hopefully I'm not going to talk too much about summary here. I'm trying to give main points before we get into kind of, my thoughts and, some of those different elements there that we kind of, I want to talk about specifically. As the events go on, we see that Snowball, they want to kind of basically have electricity or have, continue to grow the farm in ways to increase production and anything along those lines. So Snowball proposes the building of a windmill, which would allow them to essentially be a little bit more productive and have, machinery that can help take some of the work off of some of the workers. Napoleon, the other pig, is, of course, completely not on board with this. And in the end, after the meeting, when Snowball was going to propose the windmill, saying that the plans are finished and, essentially trying to give ideas of when to build it, Napoleon had some dogs stuck up on him and had Snowball chased off the thing. This is kind of where we see the main shift of power to being Napoleon only, because Snowball is no longer in the scene. And some things that we kind of brush over during these earlier points of the book are that Napoleon and Snowball have learned to read. So they have learned to read and write. And they've also tried to take they give classes to allow other animals to do the same. We come to learn that the other animals are not able to read or write. Most of them are not able to read, and maybe a handful of them can read. Particularly one of the animals, I believe it was one of the animals, Old Benjamin, was able to read, but he just had no interest. So let's go more into the kind of the analysis here, right? So I think I'll touch on some plot points as we go through. Some of the parallels here that we kind of see are that Napoleon takes full power. He ends up claiming a lot of these ideas that Snowball came up with the windmill as his own. He ends up basically claiming himself as a leader of Animal Farm. They continue to kind of gain power. There's a lot more rules, or the 7 commandments themselves are changed over time, and just things continue to essentially go more towards the Jones way, even though that was kind of the intent of getting rid of it. getting rid of him specifically. And then, so what we see here is, a lot of parallels to, I guess, our current political climate, especially here in the U.S., particularly when looking at like Trump, for example. We see some parallels to Napoleon specifically, in that he paints himself as being for the people, right? Napoleon paints himself as being for the betterment of the farm. He was one of them. He completely can change things as it is. But of course, as the story goes on, we realize that Napoleon ends up moving into the house, which was one of the commandments. We're never going to live in houses. We won't sleep in beds. They completely change that rule there. They end up sleeping in beds, and of course, there's some exceptions to this rule that end up being essentially written in later on. But what Napoleon ends up doing is he moves some of the other pigs into the house, where they're able to essentially kind of create like this committee or this group of voices or leaders that are better. Basically, they deem themselves to be smarter than the other animals because they could read and write. And of course, we actually know pigs tend to be just incredibly smart animals, period. Like actually in real life, not the ones that we see in this book. But it is interesting, the choice of the animal pig here. And of course, we see, going back to that kind of parallel with the Trump administration, he painted himself for the people, and he ends up surrounding himself with other elites or people that are inside, and just kind of encloses themselves within the thing. But they still keep this facade as everything's okay, but quite literally everything's going to shit around them. And then we see some parallels here with Squealer. And Squealer is another one of the pigs, and basically what Squealer represents is propaganda. Propaganda between, quite literally spreading misinformation. He is the pig that is primarily there with Napoleon and trying to get, everyone to understand what Napoleon's thoughts are, and of course kind of skewing things along the way. There's never, essentially Squealers, if using more present terms, Squealer gaslights the hell out of the rest of the farm animals. And we see this specifically with some of the commandments. So kind of going back into those commandments themselves and as they change. Napoleon, of course, ends up moving into the farmhouse. He ends up sleeping in the bed. He ends up, by the end, they drink alcohol. Just a continual, essential breaking of those laws. But the thing is, when these laws are being broken, they are being amended on the wall. And we learn later that this is by Squealer. But since the animals don't really know how to read, most of them don't know how to read, they're not really understanding this fact quite yet. They look at the rule and be like, wait, I thought that was something that we completely understood that we were not allowed to do. And then Squealer and it's essentially being like, oh, no, you misunderstood. If we look at the thing again, for example, we look at the rule, no animal shall sleep in a bed. They amended it to be no animal shall sleep in a bed with sheets. So they claim that instead of using sheets, because sheets were human made, the animal, or Napoleon and his the other pigs that living in the house, were sleeping between blankets, which they're basically sheets. You're sleeping with a blanket, which is arguably also human made. And then when it comes to alcohol, obviously the original commandment was no animal shall drink alcohol, and then we see the amendment of no animal shall drink alcohol to excess, which again, good rule of thumb, but still not the original rules that were created at the start of this whole rebellion here. And then as the book continues, we also see Napoleon essentially get more power hungry, and the way he does this is he deems, and so if we recall that Snowball ran off, was chased off of the farm, and then we see also that Napoleon was taking credit for a lot of Snowball's ideas, and he claims that the windmill was initially Napoleon's idea. Snowball took it from him and pretended to pass it off as his own, and Napoleon couldn't stand this, so he chased him off the farm. And then we later learned that Snowball apparently was coming back to the farm and sabotaging crops and ends up blowing the windmill down, or knocking the progress of the windmill down pretty early in their building of it. And they end up rebuilding it, but that's not the case. And then so what happens is they call a meeting, and essentially the other animals are asked whether or not they were aiding in Snowball's involvement in destroying farm things. Several animals come forward, and of course all of the animals that came forward about it were killed. And so that's where we see and then the next day they're kind of like, wait, what just happened last night during the meeting? And so they kind of recall, like, I thought that was one of the rules, that no animal should kill any other animal. And then Squealer, of course, comes back saying, oh, that wasn't the original commandment. The commandment was no animal shall kill any other animal without cause. And given that these animals were aiding Snowball in the efforts to completely get rid of, or to sabotage the farm and the production of the farm, that was enough cause to have them killed, right? And this is kind of where we see more of the that authoritarian type style of Napoleon specifically, and that is just because it's very much like, it's everything that I say is going to be how it goes, and I have the right to essentially change my mind as time goes on. Of course, the animals being a little bit more naive, and the fact that they assumed everything was going to be good, and they didn't come in with the idea that they might be screwed over along the process. They believe all this stuff going along, right? And this is particularly seen in one of the workhorses named Boxer. And Boxer could definitely be a mayor of just the general working class, right? Going out of their way to ensure that the work is getting done, even though they're not necessarily prioritizing themselves, right? And even as time goes on and the rations are cut and they're getting less food, Boxer still has the goal of like, oh, I need to complete this because Napoleon says this is something that needs to be done for the betterment of the farm. And we come to learn that, of course, this is complete crap. And essentially, Boxer is, working and working and working, and with the hopes of eventually being able to retire, because that was one of the rules that kind of was established early on, was that at the certain ages set for different animals, they're able to retire, and they're going to be sent out to a special pasture area that is going to be designated just for animals that no longer have to work. And the age for horses was 12. And so later in the book, we're closer to the end, Boxer is still working, doing, building the second version of the windmill at this point, and, just completely putting everything forward, and he ends up falling sick. He, at this point, is 11 years old. He ends up falling sick. It's told that he was going to be taken to the vet to get proper care and then come back. When the buggy that comes essentially to pick him up, Benjamin, one of the only animals on the farm that can read, notices that the words on the van that essentially comes pick him up, of course, is drawn by horses. It says that it's a horse slaughter type farm for glue and dog kibble and stuff along those lines. They quickly realize this and then try to get Boxer out of the van, but there's really no avail. The thing takes off, and then we find out 3 days later that Boxer did go into surgery. He wasn't able to make it, and he ended up dying there. Of course, Squealer happened to be there the whole time, and he, again, back to gaslighting, gaslit all the animals to thinking that, oh yeah, no, you thought that the sign on the vehicle said that, and because it did, but the veterinarian ended up buying that van from the old horse slaughter farm, and so, but he just didn't have a chance to paint it over yet, so that's why it said that. But he definitely did go to the vet. That's quite literally not true. We can definitely assume that, but what just makes it the most sad is he was 11 at that point, and he was set to retire, or supposedly set to retire at 12, and it just never happened. And of course, I think it was, as a reader, that was probably never going to happen in the first place, especially given the events and the continual essential bullshit that was happening on the farm. Yeah, so that was a little bit of a rough point there. But we kind of see a lot of that, again, parallels into our real life. We see all these, specifically when it comes to working class now, right? They're back, even 60 plus years ago, we had this idea that's like, oh, you'd be retired by the age of, I think it was 55, and then it becomes 65. And now in the present day, people that happened to, say, retire 20 years ago are being faced with these crazy price things to the point where they are not really able to retire. Because retirement, I don't think, is really built into the American dream, at least not anymore. And if it is built, it's built for not the working class. It's built for people that can afford to go without work until the end of their lives. I think we definitely see this in Boxer too, because again, not necessarily that he worked his ass off completely to the point where he quite literally collapsed there and still was just treated as a means to an end. He was treated as a body to complete a task, and then when he was not able to complete that task anymore, he was sent to be killed. And of course, they sent him to a horse slaughter farm so they can use him for glue and specifically like kibble, which is still very commonly done today, right? So when a working horse or even a race horse is done, when they can't perform anymore, they're just sent to die. And when they're sent to die, they don't die of natural causes because you don't get paid. So if you send them to get maybe made for glue and all that stuff, you at least get some money from the death of that horse. So that's exactly what happens. Of course, Napoleon, it said that they buy another case of whiskey with the money that they received from Boxer. And of course, this is just alluded to because it doesn't explicitly say this is what happens. It's just when they bring Boxer's money back, that also happened to be the time that they were able to afford another case of beer from money that came from who knows where, right? But of course, as a reader, we know exactly where it came from, which is terribly unfortunate. But kind of going back to this idea of squealer specifically, and we see this a lot in current media, right? Specifically in misinformation and also just social media, because social media is such a breeding place for misinformation. You have one person that makes a viral, I don't know, TikTok or something, and everyone believes, oh, did you hear that one thing? And it's like, that person that made that thing could have been making it for fun, could have been making it because they believe that's what happened, but there's very little basis in reality for a lot of these things, right? And of course, propaganda spans not just in present times. It is definitely something that happened a lot, especially during war times. Except the form of media has changed. Back then, it was a lot of posters and news, on newspapers and stuff along those lines. Now it's a lot more digitalized. We still definitely see it in media. We still see it on TV, in commercials, and on bus stops. You see various things, right? Even technically, if we really want to, I don't know if this is propaganda more, but we see it on during presidential elections, specifically here in the US. You see it on lawn signs. You see all this idea of, we're going to do this big thing and it's going to be better for it, right? Frankly, it's just not the case a lot of the time. And it doesn't matter what side we're on. It's regardless of what it is, it's always going to be betterment for the individual who's putting out this material or propaganda, right? If it's just a random person on the internet, they're putting out fake information, they end up getting attention for it. And whether that comes as views and followers or getting attention for it, when we're looking at the bigger scope of things when it comes to, say, presidential elections, not only are they getting attention, they're also getting money for it. And again, we definitely can see this through a lot of different recent historical events that have happened here in the US, particularly with, I remember, the 2020 election. We had all those fake those ads and stuff being run on Facebook and X, formerly known as Twitter, whatever. And we see all of that there. But we just kind of wrap it off. We just assume that's it's just news. This is just way that we're getting information. But I feel like we kind of look over the fact that a lot of this information is coming from a perspective that is intended to sway us one particular way or the other. And that's why a lot of these news sites, they're typically either left-leaning or right-leaning, and of course there's a couple more center-based news sites, but for the most part the big major ones are going to be left or right-leaning, and whichever one you receive your information from is going to be skewed in some type of way. And a really great website I like to use for this is called All Sides. And what All Sides does is basically it gives you kind of a major event, and it gives you an article from a left-leaning news source, a right-leaning news source, and then one from the center. And I always love to look at this website, particularly for the headlines. Because the headlines themselves are always, it's just kind of funny to look at. So regardless of the side, there's definitely some interesting things going on there, specifically from the propaganda type element. And that's kind of what we see with Squealer. Of course, Squealer himself in the story is definitely more, there's no sides. In Animal Farm, unfortunately, there's the animals that work and the pigs. It's kind of really all there is. And we see particularly and they're completely basing it off the animals within the farm not being smart enough to do anything about it. Because, of course, the uprising was initially an idea from Napoleon and Snowball in the beginning. So without them, they would still be working under Jones. And what we see here particularly is how Squealer uses his actual abilities to gaslight people into thinking something is just not what it was for the betterment of Napoleon, or to paint Napoleon in a better light, right? We see that a lot in literally just the changing of the commandments. Anything that we're like, oh, that wasn't what we thought we initially agreed to, and it's immediately changed to be like, oh, no, you're wrong. You didn't remember correctly. This is exactly how it was. And then eventually, continual gaslighting of the animals continue, like all the way to the end of the book, where essentially most of the animals at that point, it's been years later, a few of them are even from the time of the original uprising when Jones was, they don't even know who Jones was. It's just kind of hearsay at this point. There's a bunch of new animals there, and all of them kind of think like, oh, this is great because this is what they came into, right? They don't really know anything different. And so they're just treating it as, this is just the way it is. And Clover, which is another one of the horses, obviously saw her friend Boxer die. She lived through both the rebellion, initial ones from Jones, and she lived through both the Battle of the Windmill and the Battle of Cowshed. And she, although she might still be able to be easily manipulated in terms of what she does remember, she does recall explicitly that the rule of no animal shall be able to walk on 2 feet, right? Because the 4 legs good, 2 legs bad situation. And we get to the end of the book, and we see Squealer take away some sheep, and the sheep were notoriously known for constantly, essentially like in an anxiety-based state, they would just start, saying 4 legs good, 2 legs bad over and over again. They're taken away, and they're eventually forced to learn a new version of it, which is 4 legs good, 2 legs better, which quite literally goes against everything that they started with, right? And then we see, again, going back to the end of the book, the pigs are seen walking around on 2 legs. They all live in the farmhouse. They end up having a huge meetup with the other farmers in the local area, and these are all humans. And they're inside drinking, playing games, acting as if they were always humans, right? And then we see at the end too, and I'll read this quote. This is when Clover is looking inside, and she remembers that, oh, this is not right, but there's really not much that she can do about it at this point because, she's one of the few that's just not, there comes a point where you just can't do anything, especially if you're the only person there, right? Especially in this type of authoritative rule type of thing, right? If you speak up, she's very easy to be slaughtered just for speaking up. And so we get to the very end of the book, and this is like the last line. They're inside of the farmhouse. There was the humans and the pigs, and they're playing some type of card game. And there ends up being some kind of uproar or fight. And Orwell writes this as 12 voices were shouting in anger, and they were all alike. No question. Now, what had happened to the faces of the pigs? The creatures outside looked from pig to man, and from man to pig, and from pig to man again. But already it was impossible to say which was which. And I feel like this is definitely a perfect end to this story, because we very clearly see that progression of farm animal when they started off as pigs, and essentially them continuing to gain knowledge. This is kind of where it comes back to, is knowledge and power over the course of years. And then they get to the point where like, oh, we are above everyone else. And it also comes back to coming back to the commandments on this as well. A little bit before this last line, they go back to the wall with the commandments, and they being the farm animals, particularly Benjamin and Clover, they go back to that wall to see, what was there something different about the rule? I thought it was that they couldn't stand on 2 legs and whatever. So we go back to it, and then we see that all of the commandments are gone. They never existed, and the only message that now remains on that wall is all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. And as a reader, you have seen this happen, right? You see this continue to evolve throughout the story, and you see that the pigs don't see themselves as being equal anymore. And to be honest, did they ever really see themselves being equal? Because they were very quick to separate themselves from the working animals very early on. When Jones was rushed off, they immediately took that power position. They immediately were rummaging through that farmhouse to find books, to learn how to do things. They taught themselves how to read. There was really no reason for them to know how to do any of these things, but they needed to separate themselves from the other animals, and to do that, it's basically making themselves more human. And again, kind of going back to that mirror between real life, we see that a lot with in politics. You see that regular people, seemingly regular people, get really involved in certain political ideals, and they start to kind of abandon what their initial morals were. Again, this is not speaking for everyone. This is very much generalizing. You have this idea of, you started off doing this, I'm doing this for the people, and then they slowly turns to, I'm doing this for myself. They're doing it for themselves. And again, this is exactly what Napoleon and Snowball did. Eventually, Snowball doesn't exist anymore because Napoleon wanted the power for himself. But, he doesn't stand for equality and or everyone having, the chance to essentially just live a good life. He just only cares about whether or not he is able to live a good life. And that is, of course, through the means of having an abundant amount of food, which Napoleon, of course, has, even though the rations for everyone else were getting cut. The access to alcohol, which, of course, they have tons, even though they were never supposed to drink it initially. The ability to communicate with other farms and other humans. They're essentially able to completely, share their ideals. And again, we see it at the end too, where other farms are asking Napoleon, hey, how did you do this? How did you guys get your production up so much? Because we want to try to implement some of the things that you guys have done on here on Animal Farm, which is later, I'll get to that. Some of the things you've done on Animal Farm to implement it in their farms. And then here's where we also realize, Napoleon officially kind of abandons the name of Animal Farm, and they officially just call it Manor Farm, because they don't want the pigs themselves to be seen along with the animals. They don't want to be associated with Animal Farm as they are also animals. And again, kind of referring back to that last little passage there that I read, because between the faces of the human and man through the window, or the human and pig through the window, the lines were blurred. There was no clear distinction whether or not the faces in the window were human or pigs, and it's because their ideals and their actions were one and the same at this point. They completely shifted from their initial ideology to the one that they opposed from the very beginning. And I do think this has a lot of relevance now, and the reason it's even crazier now is because this book was published back in 1945. This was happening then. Orwell is known to be he has a lot of political commentary, and he does this in a lot of his books. This was happening then, this was happening before, and it's still currently happening now. There's these waves of, oh, we're going to do better, and then it turns back into the same, which is, it's a class system. You're the creation of a class system, because I feel, this is maybe just pure opinion, but the world does not have, they don't really have a real vision of what the world could be if it wasn't separated by classes, having the working versus the elite. If those lines are blurred, what is even happening, right? Where is the distinction between the wealthy and the poor, if we're really going to parallels like that? So that's kind of it for what I wanted to talk about. It was very rambly, and I apologize for that. I'm going to get better when it comes to episode 2 and onwards, because I've learned this week that I cannot simply just read the book and write some summary notes about it and maybe a quick brief outline without actually coming up with a very clear, this is what I'm talking about. And I definitely, it might have ended up that way in the end. Who knows? I appreciate any feedback that you guys leave in the comments, whatever happens. And I just honestly just grateful for people to listen. Again, just me rambling about these books. And then eventually we will kind of move on to, different types of stories, whether that be classics, more classics, science fiction, things like that. But I just really love talking about not only the books, but why they matter to us in our current lives. And sometimes these books are not this idealized version of society. It's kind of putting our focus back into what society is currently, what it was in the past, and unfortunately, what it likely will always be. And that is, of course, only if action is not taken to do some type of change, right? And that change needs to be continual throughout the course of time, right? Because it's that, touching back on the animal farm thing again, the initial uprising was awesome for the animals on the animal farm. It was great for them for a very brief amount of time. Then it quickly started to shift into eventually Napoleon becoming Jones. In the end, Napoleon is Jones. Nothing is different. If anything, it might actually be worse. So that's, I don't know, I just found that to be a really interesting point this week in conversation. There's definitely a lot I didn't talk about. There's a lot I probably brushed over very quickly, and that's just kind of is what it is. Episode 1 is going to be full of little fun kinks and just kind of figuring out where to go from here. But I'm really happy I started with Animal Farm, because I feel like this really is going to set the tone for this podcast and kind of going forward what we're going to be really talking about as weeks go on. And, I will get better. But for now, I am grateful for everyone who's listened this far. And if you want to follow on Instagram, Well Unread on Instagram, there I will be posting next week's book if we want to read along. And then, of course, I will also be starting, or I also have a club on Fable that we can, that I currently have opened up, and I'll also be posting the book there. And I will somehow post that link onto Instagram, and we can continue to discuss points there. And if anyone that listens has any questions, we can touch on that, or I can touch on that here in the episode, and we can, make this more of a collaborative effort here. And so I thank you guys for listening, and again, let's continue to get well unread.